ADAS is important to this industry because it is it's a new technology that's on these vehicles, and as more and more vehicles and the roads are equipped with these systems, our auctions need to know how we handle them, what type of industry standards we need to be considering.
Safety is our #1 commitment. And not only are we committed to safety of all of our team members and guests that come to our locations every day, we're also committed about what safety means to the entire transportation ecosystem. And this is why we need to all come together and really start talking about what does ADAS mean in the aftermarket.
We feel education about today's ADAS features is critical to ensure consumers remain safe behind the wheel.
So it's really, really critical at this juncture already that we come together as an industry and really talk about what's next. How do we ensure that as we are reselling vehicles, how do we think about ADAS and making sure that cars that we sell are also safe?
Hello, everyone. I am Tricia Heon, and I am the CEO of the National Auto Auction Association. NAAA is a trade association for wholesale motor vehicle auctions headquartered in suburban Washington, D.C. It comprises more than 340 domestic and international wholesale member auctions with more than 100 associate members. I'm pleased to welcome everyone to our first ADAS Summit. This event brings together industry leaders to review a topic that is important to us all. And AAA is happy to be part of this industry conversation. As ADAS technologies become increasingly available, education, awareness, and safety are topics that are top of mind for many of us. We are pleased to begin this conversation at the NAAA convention last month, and the NAAA Auction Standards Committee co-chairs will be engaging our members and inviting feedback on this important topic. We are fortunate to have Glenn Mercer help us lead today's discussion. Glenn is an independent automotive researcher with over 35 years of experience. He began at McKinsey, where he was a partner in the automotive practice, participating in hundreds of client studies over that time. Since 2006, he's been a sole practitioner. Glenn has done project work for investment firms. He's been an advisor to the auto industry associations such as NADA and NAAA, and has been a board member for automotive firms, an expert witness in automotive cases, and has taught automotive economics. Glenn has been president of the Society of Automotive Analysts and a director of the International Motor Vehicle Program. Glenn is extremely qualified to help us lead what we know will be an informative discussion about ADAS and what our industry should be talking about. Please welcome Glenn Mercer.
Thank you very much, Tricia, for that glowing introduction, and welcome everybody to this summit, which I'm sure will not be the last summit on the topic of ADAS. Tricia mentioned I've been around for quite some time, and I think in my mind, ADAS dates back to when anti-lock brakes first showed up as sort of a very initial shot across the bows as far as ADAS goes. And then since then, it's been alphabet soup as we get ABS, ESP, LDW, AEB, etc. In thinking about the topic today, to me, it's sort of a three-legged stool, and we're going to have speakers who address all three of those legs. There's the technology leg, and certainly the automotive OEMs and their suppliers are generating, again, this alphabet soup of 3- and 4-letter abbreviations at quite a clip, such that I think the average customer has no idea how many ADAS features there are on her or his car. So the technology is one leg. The second leg is the consumer himself and herself. And we all know people who say, I won't buy another car without lane departure warning, for example, and other people who say, as soon as I buy my car, I disable all those features because they drive me crazy. So there's the consumer leg to the stool. The third leg, which we'll talk a lot about today, is regulation. Cars are, as they say, born with original sin. When you build a car, you're likely going to, at some point, hit somebody, and ADAS contributes to the reduction of that chance of doing that. And of course, in that case, we have our government resources at state and federal and other levels intervening to make sure it all works well. And so without further ado, we're going to start off on the regulatory front with Hugo Carmona, recently named by NAAA as a Warren Young Fellow for 2022. Congratulations. Has had quite a career in government affairs, starting out as a House of Representatives Deputy District Director in California, and now at Cox as Senior Manager of Government Affairs. He has his law degree from the University of California, a member of the State Bar of California, and currently serves as co-chair of NAAA's Legislative Committee as NAAA tries to keep, on behalf of its members, ahead of, abreast of, and deeply involved in these matters. So I'm going to hand this over now to Hugo, who will talk to us about regulatory update.
Good afternoon. My name is Hugo Carmona. I'm a Senior Manager of Government Affairs at Cox Automotive, focusing primarily on state legislation and regulation affecting our various brands. On our campus, it is quite common to hear folks refer to the ACES future, which stands for Autonomous, Connected, Electric, and Shared. ACES represents the vision that we have for the next generation of transportation and guides much of our strategic decision-making. Today, I've been invited to give an overview of the regulatory landscape as it relates to ADAS systems, which, as I will get into in a second, is not so much a landscape, but closer to a sketch or a general outline of what is expected of vehicle manufacturers, ADAS systems manufacturers, and aftermarket and service providers. One quick aside, as I started going down this path of research, I realized that we must be careful to distinguish between autonomous driving system regulations, which relates to autonomous vehicle testing and deployment for what the Society of Automotive Engineers, or SAE, would call level 3 of driving autonomy or higher, and advanced driver assistance systems regulations, which relates to SAE levels 0 through 2 and mainly involves minimum standards and removing simple barriers. At SAE levels 0, 1, and 2, the lower levels of automation that ADAS systems support, the federal government, and by extension the states, has taken the position that overly prescriptive laws and requirements would be premature at this time. The U.S. Department of Transportation, the National Highway Safety and Traffic Administration, and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration have, for years, all declined to issue regulations that strictly govern the installation, use, and repair of ADAS systems. Now, that's not to say that there have not been attempts, nor am I saying that the federal government will remain hands-off forever. What I am saying is that manufacturers are being afforded flexibility to determine how technologies are implemented. Thus far, the U.S. government's guidance on these matters has been malleable and technology neutral, evolving as technology does. With that in mind, let me walk you through a few examples. On the federal side, most of the U.S. government's thoughts on ADAS can be accessed through a series of agency rulemakings. The Department of Transportation published a series of autonomous vehicle studies, most recent AV 4.0 in 2020, discussing general principles of safety, promoting efficient markets, and ensuring a consistent federal approach. NHTSA published an extensive rulemaking in November 2020 on automated driving system safety principles. While this was more directed to those higher levels of automation that I referred to earlier, 3 through 5, it is important to note the consistency in the messaging. There is no appetite for prescriptive requirements like federal motor vehicle safety standards. However, with ADAS becoming prevalent in basically all new models of vehicles, we may be getting closer to a point in time where NHTSA will need to change that stance. One other takeaway from this rulemaking, which is consistent with the hands-off approach we're now accustomed to, is the reference to research documents that NHTSA signaled would form the foundation for any future safety frameworks. Among those groups that were cited as leaders in developing standards were the RAND Corporation, NVIDIA, and the OEMs. NHTSA itself has developed an instantaneous safety metric that is helpful for any players in the ADAS space. I mentioned that most of the progress on the federal side has been done through regulation. Here are two examples of federal legislation that we should keep in mind as we work towards industry standards. In 2017, members of Congress introduced the Self-Drive Act, a bill which was not enacted into law, but would have preempted states from making any laws related to partially and fully automated vehicles, as well as provide uniform standards to manufacturers. Most recently, last year's bipartisan infrastructure law included a requirement for the Department of Transportation to study how ADAS systems can enhance driver focus and curb distracted driving. Again, safety being the predominant policy reason cited for the need for these types of laws. What you've not heard me mention is any law or regulation prescribing how to repair or calibrate ADAS systems. Absent these laws or regulations, chances are that if a part that houses ADAS needs to be replaced, the replacement part has to come from the OEM. The best option for a repair is to rely on OEM parts to ensure the perfect fit for the vehicle. Also, some OEMs require special diagnostic tools and specialists who have experience in handling them. The costs for these types of repairs are naturally higher, and not every body repair shop has access to all necessary OEM resources. Over the years, a few states have attempted to codify that vehicle servicers, and especially independent repair shops, are not bound by what the OEM dictates. Utah, Illinois, New Hampshire, and I'm sure a few other states that I may have missed, have introduced laws that say if a vehicle is equipped with ADAS, the entity performing the scan and/or calibration shall not be limited to tooling or equipment dictated or recommended by the OEM, which would substantially reduce costs for vehicle repair shops, but could also steer us away from industry standards. The last state law that I'll mention is the Right to Repair Act, which was passed in Massachusetts nearly 10 years ago and updated in 2020 to include telematics systems. The concept of right to repair is not unique to the automotive industry. It is the idea that all independent repair shops should have the same access to data as OEMs and OEM partners enjoy. Supporters of the initiative argue that it would extend consumer choice in car repair sites, increase competition, and decrease costs of car repair. Opponents of the initiative argue that it would result in cybersecurity risk and possibly make vehicle data more vulnerable. Automakers quickly challenged the updated Massachusetts law in 2020. That lawsuit is still pending in a U.S. District Court in Boston. So, I know that we just ran through a law in a short amount of time. But while much has been said and discussed on the topic of ADAS, ADAS minimum standards, and ADAS repairs, the federal government has clearly signaled that it will show deference to industry standards to the extent that they have been developed. That's why today's summit is so important, so that remarketers can fully understand what their responsibilities are as they come into more regular contact with vehicles equipped with ADAS. I hope that you found this brief regulatory and legislative update helpful, and I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to NAAA and the organizers for arranging this summit.
And thank you, Hugo. It's really good in the context of multiplying ADS installations and the multiplying complexity of these systems and the regulatory environment in which they operate to have someone like Hugo on board at Cox and AAA to help us walk through this morass. One thing that always strikes me about all this when it comes to ADAS at the low end of the SAE levels and autonomous vehicles at the higher end is traditionally and simplistically, and Dr. Rosekind will know much better than I will about this, is that the states kind of regulate the driver and the federal regulates the vehicle. And what do you do when the car becomes semi-autonomous? Who is the driver and who regulates at the intersection of these two sort of colliding views? We'll see how it all sorts out. sorry, maybe not sort out. Hugo mentioned calibration, and so that leads very well into our next speaker, who will, Dave DeBoer will be representing Burke Porter Group. He'll tell you a little bit about Burke Porter to begin with, but crucially, Burke Porter is going to help us understand the technology and the calibration in the real world of this technology. It's nice to talk about AEB, but it's better to understand how it actually works in the real world. Burke Porter Group has been around for half a century, 16 brands, 40 locations, 30 countries, and they do assembly systems, medical systems, healthcare systems. But today we'll be talking specifically about their vehicle testing and vehicle and ADAS calibration capabilities for both at the OEM level and the aftermarket level. So I'd like to hand over now to Dave DeBoer.
I am David DeBoer, and I am the Vice Chairman of the Burke Porter Group. Burke Porter Group was founded in 1953 and is the proud inventor of the DVT, or Dynamic Vehicle Testing Machine. Saying it more simply, we invented the treadmill for automobiles. Since that time, Burke Porter has expanded into OEM vehicle complete end-of-line testing and is now the world leader in testing vehicles at the end of the automotive assembly line. In terms of ADAS, since their first fully automated machine in 2006, BPG has been providing automated ADAS testing equipment direct to the automotive OEMs in their factories. We are providing the methods by which automobiles are programmed and the associated sensors for ADAS are programmed, making the vehicle safe for driving on the road. I am here today because I and the Burke Porter Group are passionate about making vehicles safe. As we compare the methods of calibrating ADAS features in the factory to aftermarket repairs and service facilities, we are seeing considerable differences requiring increased technician training, increased time, and space to perform these calibration activities. Given the ever-increasing technology on today's automobiles intersecting with a challenged and reduced technician work base, we feel education about today's ADAS features is critical to ensure consumers remain safe behind the wheel. What I'd like to share with you is a brief primer on what is ADAS, Advanced Driver's Assistance Systems, what are the trends we're seeing in ADAS in terms of volume, number of sensors and complexity, and mandated and voluntary acceptance of ADAS across the vehicle manufacturing set. And thirdly, the ADAS factory calibration systems we use in the factory versus the aftermarket calibration systems you'll observe in the service base. Finally, I'd like to conclude by giving you my view, or our view, of the 8 steps to a proper calibration. What is ADAS? Simply put, ADAS is a sensor-enabled driver's assistance vehicle. It's a feature that allows us to look around the vehicle in a variety of different ways. It's a variety of ultrasonic sensors for parking, short and medium range radars, largely for cruise control and adaptive braking, and a variety of cameras and sensors, making the vehicle aware of the environment around itself. What's important for us to probably talk about today is what are the most common ADAS features and those that are becoming more or less like seat belts or anti-lock brakes on a car. And those are, first and foremost, emergency braking. Largely driven by a radar combined with a camera looking forward in front of you, the vehicle is assessing if there's any dangers and putting itself into action by either braking or withdrawing the action of the cruise control. Next to this is the lane departure warning, and this is when you deviate out your lane. The car is recognizing this. Motors in your steering wheels will start to draw your wheel or steering wheel driving back into the lane. And behind you, in areas you can't see, you have normally radars, cameras, or a combination of both that are looking in your blind spot and giving you detections or even allowing you to be steered back out of harm's way. This is generally what ADAS represents in the most common form. We call these the dynamic or the safety features of the ADAS systems. What about growth? We're still in early innings. Right now in 2022, we see about 292 million cars driving in the US. We call that the car park. Most of those are on average 12 years of age, and about 21% of those cars, or about 60 million of those cars, are driving on the roads with forward-facing safety systems, radar and camera. We see this growing at a 25% cumulative average growth rate, and we see it going to over 100 million vehicles by 2025. Essentially, what is the concept? Take you back to your trigonometry days. You have a vehicle and you have a coordinate grid system. You might recall X, Y, and Z. And the origin of that coordinate system is the X equals 0, Y equals 0, and Z equals 0. In our automotive factory, we must move fast. We have about 2 minutes to get a vehicle calibrated. So the first thing we have to do is get the vehicle into a known position. We largely use the axle, and in particular the front axle, and we pull a vehicle into a driving chock as depicted here. We then center the vehicle such that the center of the vehicle is on the center line of our machine. We then have a coordinate 0, 0, 0 position at the center of the front axle. And from that point, we put targets all around the vehicle, go into the OBD port, and allow the modules on board to do calibrations with known targets in known spots. So the key point here is that factory automated systems use an axle position. We'll note later that body points are commonly used in the aftermarket in a bay where you have front emblems or body panels that you're measuring off of. Those are different than the factory, and this is the key difference as we compare the two methodologies. Taking a look at a couple of factory machines on the right, I call this an opera curtain machine. A vehicle is pulled into a bay. This is commonly a European method. That bay centers the car, and then a variety of targets, including an opera curtain of targets, drops down in front of the vehicle, allowing the sensors to then go into a software-based calibration mode. On the left, a more common way in the United States, we call it a gantry system. Again, you pull onto a chock system. The vehicle is centered in the middle. Targets are placed all around it, even on the floor, and then targets are on a gantry moved in front of the vehicle so that the various sensors can be calibrated. I have a few short videos here. This is the first concept we call the vehicle centering system for ADAS. I'll do this a few times. Vehicle is moved to center position in a front chock. Do this again. Wheel is put in chocked, centered. Do it one more time. Driven in, chocked, and centered. What does that look like in a factory? You have the same system where the vehicle is already brought in, it's chocked in the front wheels, the vehicle is centered, and now the gantries in front are moved in front of the vehicle. In this case, both the camera and the radar systems are put in front of the vehicle for calibration. What is the difference in the aftermarket? I will show you. This is a sample. You start with a body part, in this case, the center of the rear emblem, and you drop a plumb bob to put point A on the floor. You go to the front of the vehicle, you drop a plumb bob to point B on the floor. You then have to do your trigonometry on the floor, connecting points A and B, making a straight line, or the center line of the car to C and D. Using C and D as origin points, you strike arcs with a cable, and those two arcs cross in points J and G. With that, you then have to place a target at the proper point and put the vehicle into a calibrate mode. Sometimes in this particular car, you have a choice between one position or up to 3 positions. First of all, you have to make sure you have the right procedure, then you have to go through these steps. This is complicated, requires a lot of training, takes time and space. This definitely invites human error, and we do believe that in the future, there should be a better way. What happens if you get this wrong? This is a picture that we've seen in an automotive garage. You have a technician on the left-hand side holding a tetrahedral for a radar while his counterpart is in the car with the scan tool, believing that the scan tool inside the car is aware of where that target's position. When the scan tool doesn't properly cal, a message is sent out to the gentleman, please move to the left, move to the right. The consequence of that is the picture in the middle to the right is that you could incorrectly calibrate the radar to think that the oncoming car is actually straight ahead when you should be looking ahead. In this particular instance, as this oncoming truck comes, this will fire off the radar or the anti-lock brakes, either adjusting you to a halted position in an inverted stop or slow down and annoyingly hit your adaptive cruise control and slow you down. So the consequence is rising of getting it wrong. In our opinion, we feel the following 8 steps should be made in any calibration. The first and foremost is training. We need to ensure that our technicians properly trained. They understand what vehicle they have in front of them and where to get the proper documentation. We believe that there should be training courses and that credentials should be given. Once we have properly evidenced a trained technician, we only let those technicians perform this calibration. Number 2, ADAS calibration, especially static calibration, is a measurement. And measurements use gauges. Even a tape measures a gauge. Those gauges can become damaged. They can become incorrect. A lot of laser-based gauges can be changed with temperature. We recommend that you ensure that all gauges that you're using to measure are calibrated. Some of these things are within 3 millimeters requirements, and in the factory, we're seeing sub-tenths of millimeters. Those gauges can be off and cause your calibration to be off. Number 3, you should ensure that you have the exact knowledge of the vehicle you are in front of. People believe that the VIN decodes are accurate. They are not. They're notoriously inaccurate. They have errors. Also, you can have a vehicle, I'll use a Toyota as example. Sometimes they have 7 different bumper configurations, and those bumpers are where those radars are mounted. You need to go through the effort and make sure you have some form of a rules engine to make sure you understand through a check and balance procedure that you have the right vehicle for the right procedure that you're using. This can be very challenging. Next, you need to check in your vehicle. This is very similar to checking into your doctor's office. In the doctor's office, we get blood pressure checked, we get temperature checked, we get our height and weight checked. It's the same thing. OEMs require at various levels, various different OEMs have different requirements to check things such as fuel level, the tire pressure, the fender height, all these things that are causing the vehicle to sit differently on top of the ground need to be checked and checked in. These are required per the OEM procedure, and they are different for each OEM. Once we've done all of steps 1 through 4, then we need to obtain a target. There are hundreds of different targets. Some of them vary from OEM to OEM for sure, and they also vary within vehicle sets within OEMs. So you need to make sure you have the right target. Some of the variations are rather quite small, and so you need to check and double check to make sure you have the right target. Once we have the right target, we need to prove that we've put it in the right position. Remember the plumb bobs in the measurements and the spatial relationship. How do you know you have it in the right position? The only way to prove it right now is to snap a picture either with your tablet or with your iPhone, but even that is better than just saying, trust me. So target position, correct target are critical. Once you have steps 1 through 6, you can then move to step 7. With steps 1 through 6 confirmed, you can then move into the OBD port, plug in the authorized OEM scan tool. That's what we recommend. There are other choices. And then put the unit into its calibration mode once you know and have attested to all the target conditions. And after all of this, the final and most important step, we believe, is to make sure you fully document this. We like to create what we call a repair history file and make sure that that is tracked per the VIN number and per that order number. These, we believe, are the 8 proper steps to protect our customers and make sure that we are driving safe.
That was amazing. I think what really fascinated me about the Burke Porter DeBoer presentation is the linkage it shows between the sort of esoteric Silicon Valley artificial intelligence view of the world and down to the nitty-gritty of how to actually get these systems to work in real life. When you've got 6 or 7 ultrasonic sensors in a bumper, and then a customer, a driver puts a I've been to Wall Drug bumper sticker across one. How do we get the thing to still function in the real world? It was an interesting sort of verbal glitch at the very beginning of his talk, where he talked about the vehicle obsessing about objects in the road ahead. He corrected that to assessing, but it really is the vehicle continuously obsessing about everything in the vicinity and dealing with them, dealing with those objects. And then, as a last comment here, it is fascinating to me here. We're almost having an arms race in collision repair between the incredible increased cost of adding all these systems to be able to calibrate and work on these cars. We're far from the days of rattle can and masking tape. And that's the cost race, but the revenue race on the other side, as there's more and more work that needs to be done whenever we fix a car rather than just beating on panels. Moving onward, so now we've talked about technology a little bit, and we've talked about regulation a little bit, and now we'll talk about technology and regulation and consumers with our keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Rosheim. Internationally recognized transportation safety professional, 30 years of experience, has worked for at least 3 organizations, starting with NHTSA, where he's administrator, NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and of course NASA. He broke with the N series by going off to Zoox, a vehicle startup. So he's got the vehicle startup perspective as well as the incumbent OEM perspective, and now very recently to the California Mobility Center, which is working on California's attempts to figure out how to survive in this brave new world of proliferating mobility options. I will close by saying that thanks to his work on fatigue in humans and how that impacts their performance, Dr. Rosekind has a distinct honor of being called by no less of an authority than Car and Driver magazine a sleep expert. I thought we were all sleep experts, but this is the person who truly is expert on sleep and how it interacts with driving. But I know you will not be put to sleep by this presentation, which I've taken a look at, and it looks really great. So over to you, Mark, and when you're done, we'll do some Q&A.
Thank you, Glenn. And I really appreciate actually the gracious introduction. Most people do focus on the automotive and safety part, and good for you for getting the history. Almost 25 years of helping professionals stay awake and at peak performance when they're on the job. Especially critical when you're thinking of driving, but probably every time you take a flight, that's pretty critical as well. Today, though,
you want the pilots to be awake, yes.
You know, kind of the starting point, right?
Starting point.
So today we're going to talk about why safety really should be the imperative here. And we're going to put my comments basically in the context of ADAS, but I think whenever you think mobility, safety has to be the core, the foundational element that you're going to talk about. And so today I'm really going to talk about two parts of that. One is making it personal for all of us, I hope, again. And the second part is when you think about safety and you think about ADAS, then how do we move forward? And I think the presentations, Hugo, to the others, and your comments, Glenn, have been really important for us to talk about, well, all this information is great, but how do we move this forward to ensure that we are doing everything possible to get the maximum benefit from ADAS to help save lives and prevent injuries on our roadway? And so I'm going to actually start here. You know, this is where the doc looks at the wife and says, he's one tough cookie. I've never seen anyone bounce back from an autopsy before. And I show this because, of course, nobody actually bounces back from an autopsy. And we're going to talk about the fatalities on our roadways. There are always big numbers that are discussed, and I will as well. But I think this kind of brings up, we need to personalize this. Safety is all about individuals. And you all know somebody. It was a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a community member, potentially a colleague that you know, et cetera, where road safety and crashes, including injuries and death, has touched their lives and probably you. And so I'm going to actually take us through, as a board member at the NTSB, I find the next few slides help us really ground safety. It's away from the big numbers, but it's a way to make it personal. So for example, Dawn Roberts, she was 20 years old. She's picking up the black SUV, was her first vehicle, a used car she was getting. Her boyfriend dropped her off at the dealer to pick it up, and they're driving back in tandem. They're on their phones, and all of a sudden her phone goes blank. She basically hit the guardrail, went across the median, hit another guardrail, flipped 180 degrees in the air, and landed upside down on the white minivan you see in the lower left. Dawn lost her life, as did 4 tourists who were in that minivan on the left-hand side there. The one survivor, I believe, was a child who was in a car seat in this particular crash. This one is a young man who had a fairly new truck and was literally texting while driving. And I always tell people, like, try to see where this actually is manifested in this photo. The young man actually hit a truck tractor, and the 2 buses that were behind him, also in tandem, basically the front bus hit his truck and pancaked it on top of the truck tractor. This is his vehicle right there. And again, I bring this up because not only did that young man lose his life, but there was a young student in the back of the bus here who also lost her life. You got to see these bent metal photos to understand these are people that we're talking about when we discuss these numbers. This is a photo of the worst crash related to drunk driving that has ever occurred in the United States. This was a church group coming back from a state fair, hit by a drunk driver. And you can see that, and this is, you know, quite a while ago, 34 years. And what you see is out of the 67 passengers, 27 lost their lives, 34 injuries, mostly very bad burns. And you see that this The driver that hit them was 3 times over the legal limit at the time that this occurred. Again, you got to look at these photos. You have to realize when we talk safety, it's not just about big numbers. It's about the lives that are changed forever. And just as I started the very first one, when we've lost these people, we cannot bring them back. This is lost to their families, the communities, to our society once they're gone. So let's talk about those numbers. These are the NHTSA estimates from 2021, 42,915 lives lost. I always try to insist, while administrator, that people know the exact number, because every one of those is alive. And again, try to highlight that with the bent metal slides. But we have to look at that in the context of 5.8 million crashes that are occurring on our roadways with 2.6 million injuries. Even if you don't lose your life, there are injuries that occur that are so serious they are life-changing. And the asterisk is there for a reason, because 95% of all the lives that are lost in transportation in the United States, 95% are on our roadways. And I like to bring this up. In aviation, they went 12 years with no lives lost in a commercial aviation incident, 12 years straight, and then 1 life was lost. And I'm just like, here's your challenge, automotive safety. How do we get there? And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So one of the things I like to highlight that's kind of critical to the technology we're talking about, 94% of crashes are due to some human choice or error that gets made. This is a NHTSA study. You'll see it in a slide that's coming up from 2015. What's been interesting for me is at the NTSB, we know that every crash involves a chain of events. It's not one thing. Yes, there's a creation of a probable cause, et cetera, but it's always a chain of events. That's where this statistic comes from. Basically, the last event in that chain is related to the human. And in 94% of the cases, it's a choice or error that we make. I'm not going to get into it because I could spend all my time talking about it, but recently there's been some controversy about this number. What I find so interesting is the controversy is about how the number is used. It's not actually about the number. So I'll tell you, when I was a scientist at NASA doing that fatigue work, we already knew for a couple of decades, 70 to 80% of incidents in aviation were related to the human. There was a human factors element to whatever it was that created that incident. The reason I bring that up is it's really critical to know, even if you identify a probable cause and it may involve the human, it does not mean that the solution, that the intervention, that the mitigation strategy will be specifically about the human. And in fact, that's another error that gets made often, which is deciding that, well, the human made the classic is pilot made a mistake and there's an aviation crash. Let's just, fire that pilot. We won't have the problem anymore. Well, if it ends up that somebody gave them the wrong information, somebody had the wrong training, there was equipment failure, et cetera, firing that pilot isn't going to actually solve your problem. Okay. You need to know the source of the error, but your strategy, and in this case, what we're talking about is using technology to help you basically identify or mitigate that error from occurring. So what's interesting about that is, so what are some of those choices or errors that get made? This gives you a sense of some of the actual numbers of what's out there. So when we look at the fatalities, the number one thing for 20 years is alcohol related. I'm not going through all these, but it's humans that make a decision to drink and drive, to put their foot on the accelerator, not to get the sleep that they need, or to pick up their phone. And even the top one, seatbelt, that's not causal for a crash to occur. But today in the United States, 91% of people are wearing their seatbelts. But in fatal crashes, half the people that are dying aren't wearing their seatbelt. Okay, again, a human choice that has an effect. And I'm not going to get into this very much, but most people know 94%, but never actually look at the paper. I'm going to bring the one really critical pie chart out of there just so you can see it. So when you say, like, what makes up that 94%? Recognition errors. Well, that's a problem for humans, right? We have one set of eyes, usually on the front of our head, and they're going to look in one direction. If something's going on in another direction, you could miss a critical piece of information. So you see on here the kind of errors, the sources of the errors that occur. I always find it fascinating. People sometimes ask, so what's the other 6% of what accounts for the errors? Well, that's actually defects. Environmental, which you see here, include roadway as well as weather, and then other unknown things. But humans are key here. And again, so what strategies are we going to use to actually try and make this better and save those lives? So I love the quote from Einstein. If we just keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome, well, that's the definition of insanity. And that happens an awful lot in safety, in transportation, in a lot of different arenas. We'll just keep doing the same thing and think, well, that's going to help us save more lives. Okay. All of you know the numbers I just showed. The estimates for 2022 are showing those numbers going up. Okay. It always fascinates me that people like to say, we're in a crisis. We did the same thing when the numbers went up. We're in a crisis. Let me just say, probably for a couple decades already, we've been in a crisis. And part of the reason I love to show this slide is because what we learned from Einstein is if we keep doing the same stuff, thinking we're going to save those lives, prevent those crashes, et cetera, that's insane. What we really need is to think about where's the innovation going to come from that's going to help really advance safety. And at NHTSA, people said, well, you can really only have one or the other, right? You can be safe, and that means we're going to put you in a box and keep you really protected. Innovation doesn't fit there. Or you can have, innovation, including Silicon Valley, let's break things off and et cetera. That's not really good for safety, right? But I do point out safety innovation is actually what we need here. And we need to be innovating in the safety arena as much as we are in all the technical arenas that we're working on. And so what does this actually mean, safety innovation? So I'm going to just pull, because I like to remember this guy. This is Gene Cernan. Captain Cernan was the commander of Apollo 17. He is the last human who walked on the moon. And I was so fortunate to get to know Gene over about the last 10 years of his life. I saw he had this photo he was carrying at a meeting. I said, oh, is that for me? He came back and he had it on there, what day is it? Which was Glenn, obviously a referral to the fatigue work that I've been doing with NASA, et cetera. But Gene was amazing. I mean, besides, tail hook landing, fighter jets on air carriers on the water, and again, to the moon, the last guy who walked on the moon, just you think about it, it's taken us how many decades to get back again, and we're still working at it. But I say that because one of the things in talking to Gene and thinking about NASA is, so what attitude, when you approach safety, what attitude do you need? And how do you use that attitude to turn it into some action? So when I think of NASA, and this really comes from Gene, thinking about how should we be approaching safety, it may seem so out of place, but we need a safety attitude that says, how do we go big and bold for the moonshot? These little, changes in, the number's gone up, 1%, 2%, it's down 2%, et cetera. If we really want to start saving lives in a major way, what's it going to take? We got to go in with a safety attitude, which is big and bold about the moonshot. Okay. And again, most people are going to think, what? This is safety. How can you think that way? We have to think this way if we want safety innovation that's going to make a difference. But what's important is, how do you take that attitude, turn it into an action? It's this. You apply lessons learned. You don't go in just sort of without any constraints. You make sure that what you've already learned in safety, in technology, in trust, et cetera, gets applied to that big, bold moonshot that we want to take to enhance safety. And I bring this up because I think, again, most people, it's just like, let's keep doing the same thing with incremental improvements. That's not going to get us there. It's not going to get us to the major improvement we need to see on our roadway to prevent crashes, save lives, and prevent injuries. So this mindset and this kind of action, and we're seeing this already happen with the technology that's going on. But let's talk about that. In the automotive industry, and having worked at NASA, as well as NTSB across all modes, and then at NHTSA, I can say the automotive industry has primarily been born out of a reactive safety culture. You wait till a crash is going to happen. And basically, it's like, it's going to happen. There's going to be a crash. So let's think about afterwards, okay, what should we have done to maybe put more protection in there? Seatbelts, airbags, emergency response. But it's reactive until, after the crash. In aviation, for several decades, how did they get to that 0 lives lost? That's with a proactive safety culture. What do you do to prevent incidents from occurring in the first place? That's the transition that we're just starting to see. That's what this technology is all about. How do we move automotive safety from reactive, and you still need that because things happen, but how do we move it to being more proactive? So we're actually preventing things from happening in the first place. So that's what this slide is about, right? I mean, on the top there is kind of a classic. It's inevitable. There are going to be crashes. Well, we can't stay there. We have to go to the bottom slide, which is where ADAS and future autonomous vehicle technology is all about. Let's prevent those incidents from happening in the first place. Critical concept for people. While we talk about the technology, great discussion of the 8 items of how to calibrate, etc. Let's keep this in mind. It's all in the service preventing crashes, injuries, and saving lives on our roadways. The safety has to work. And how do we do that in an innovative way to be proactive? So you've seen all this, and I just put this on here really just to make the point. There's a lot of things already on the vehicle, and I'm going to say this a bunch of times to get this straight, including in one slide that's got the letters there. But one of the challenges right now is people confusing ADAS with ADS, automated driving systems, truly, fully self-driving vehicles. Major problem right now, okay? And again, I'm going to repeat this a few times. It's not a memory problem. It's because I think we need to emphasize this several times, which is these things are already on the road. They're already on your vehicle. They provide safety now, okay? While the ADS, fully automated driving systems, they're still coming. And we can talk about that future a little bit later. But it's critical to know these are already on the road. And so that's why I put this on here, because they're already on the road and they're actually already bringing safety. And in a few slides, I'm going to talk about it. But I think one of the things that your industry can already be thinking about is actually these are already on the road. And we're going to we really need to make sure that people understand what they've got and how it's supporting as an innovation, a safety innovation. How's it supporting safety on the road today? And I don't think we do that enough, frankly. I think there's room for a lot of research and data to show how these are already being effective. And we also have to make it clear that on the right there, ADAS, that's the future, okay? And I think it's fascinating watching the debate that's going on, but guess what? More money, more years, more whatever. The reality is safety is now being delivered by ADAS. It's on the road today. We can't lose sight of it. It's going to help us save lives in an even bigger way if we focus on that. And I hope I don't have to say this too many times, but clearly if this is, if ADAS or safety features that really make a difference, and there is in fact an incident, man, you got to make sure that safety device is repaired in a way that brings you that safety again, right? I mean, I'm looking at the calibration things like, how critical is this, right? You've just added an incredible piece of technology that can help save lives. If it's in an incident and doesn't get repaired correctly, it's no longer a safety device, right? I mean, it's just like, it's so basic. I'm hoping that one I don't have to repeat too many to this audience because it's so basic of what you're trying to deliver here. What's really interesting, and people don't often know this one, this is a paper that NHTSA put out in 2015, basically looking at 14 technologies over about a 50-year period. And those 14 were seatbelts, airbags, electronic stability control, et cetera. Look at that number. Over 50 years, NHTSA demonstrated that 613,501 lives had been saved. So think about it. We can't do this, but if we had the ability at 40,000 lives lost per year, if we could have taken all that technology and squished it into a number of years where we would have taken advantage of this, we could have had 15 years with no lives lost on our highways, on our roadways. We know technology works, and we've gone there, again, as one of the critical solutions and strategies for helping us to save more lives and prevent more injuries on our roadways. Now, one of the things I think that people just totally forget sometimes is that when you're talking about, different kinds of technology evolution or societal transformation, that takes a long time. So I just put these up here. The iPhone's been around for a dozen years already. That's the one at the end. Many of you may remember the brick at the left side there. This is really critical because we want to bring these safety innovations, especially through technology, to our roadways, but it's not like we're going to get it tomorrow. But we need to highlight the ADAS part are on our roads today already. So they're a tool we already have. Should they get better? Should they evolve? Should they improve? Absolutely. Could we go to full self-driving? Maybe, hopefully. But right now we have technology that's available to us to help make roads safer. Now, Hugo brought some stuff up. I'm going to be a little difficult, not about what he said, but to be clear, I actually think to talk with this group, well, everyone likes to say, what's the regulation going to be? I think what Hugo pointed out, it's kind of hard to say that actually the federal government in any, whether it was Congress or at NHTSA, DOT, et cetera, has really taken a major stand. It supported the technology. It says this is a great potential for life-saving, but it hasn't really done a lot of specific regulation. And when people ask me about this, excuse me, when people ask about this, this is the path I say that you should think of for regulation. First is innovation. That's the world we live in right now. We're seeing so much development, so many new pieces of technology, so many new options and opportunities. It's just amazing. We need to collect the data to move to the next step, which are data-driven best practices. So there's a lot, tons of innovation there. What really works? Data needs to demonstrate that. And when we get that data, that will become the foundation for when regulation gets in place. It's no secret that, and having been in the seat of the administrator, I can tell you, when you're looking to consider regulation, you look to see what's out there. You look for data and you look for industry best practices. And they can provide a framework or a foundation when you're actually considering the regulation that you want to create. In fact, and I'm not going to get into it, but you need, a good 10, 15% minimum penetration of a certain technology before you have enough data for a cost-benefit analysis at OMB. Okay, whole nother side of it, but the more you can get the innovation being driven by best practices that are data-driven, the more you're going to help future regulation. And I put this out here because at some point, I want us to talk about, this is the next few slides, this is how you control your destiny. Don't wait for the federal government to tell you how this should be done, what the standard should be, the best practices for how these things should be repaired, what the criteria should be for the procedures, et cetera. You want to think about doing that as an industry right now. These are on the road right now. How do we make sure they get repaired and are going to make sure the life-saving safety opportunities are going to persist even after they come out of a repair shop? And so I just put these up as two examples. Some of you are probably familiar with Auto ISAC. That's an industry-led cybersecurity related kind of activity. Goes on in economics and all kinds of other areas. But that was also started for auto cybersecurity. The industry started that. The industry leads it. NHTSA is part of it, helped kind of push it to get started, but the industry leads it. The one at the bottom is something actually I'm just so pleased. When I was at NHTSA, we basically challenged all the auto manufacturers to make automatic emergency braking a standard feature by 2022. So when I was there, it was typically an average of 8 to 10 years to see a regulation actually get signed into law. Okay. And so we did this basically in September 11, 2015. And we said, okay, automakers, come together. We'll set some, basic foundational criteria. And then let's make sure that we can provide everyone, every new vehicle by 2022 should have AEB. And as you know, there are all kinds of different forms of AEB, and there's, and I'm not going to get into all of that. You heard some of it earlier, et cetera. But the key is, how do we get it to everybody? And if they did it by 2022, that would have beat regulation by anywhere from 5 to 7, maybe even 8 years. Okay. And so I think it's interesting. We're over 90% actually, when we actually made the announcement, it was 20 manufacturers. And you saw that slide already at the very beginning. And I think it's a great example of how, guess what? Industry came together and said, we want to deliver AEB safety to all new vehicles. And it ends up, there were several, IIHS, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, Consumer Reports, 4 different groups that kind of watched this progress. And that's why, again, I don't know the number, but it's over 90% of vehicles in 2022, new vehicles in 2022 are being manufactured with AEB. And I think it's interesting, people that don't know where that came from don't realize that was actually an industry initiative to make that happen. My point again, don't wait for the federal government to do this. You can take the initiative, and you've already done it to some extent, right, with the AEB. So I wanted to put these up because I think these are examples of where, again, you could control a bunch of your own destiny. These are just a few areas where the industry could get together for collaboration. Everybody, I think, who's been speaking has talked about education. And, I'm going to point out again, people have different, advanced driver assistance systems on their vehicle. They don't even know, okay? The terminology. There were some groups just a few years ago that try to say, why don't we try and get some, terminology, which, by the way, doesn't mean you can't have specified stuff for a particular manufacturer, But let's start with some general criteria. That's critical to the education part, right? There could be data sharing. I can't emphasize enough. I think there's a real need for more data about how beneficial these safety features are today. You know, people are predicting whether full self-driving is going to make a difference, this and that. That's all crystal ball. These are on the road today. Let's start collecting data to show how effective they are. And as they evolve technologically, let's make sure they evolve to get even better. Data are critical to that. And there are ways for the industry to promote that, share that, et cetera, as well as the testing that goes on, including what you're talking about specifically here, which again is you can't have all this life-saving technology. Something happens, literally could just be a bump in a driveway or in a crash. When it's back on the road again, it has to be repaired up to a standard to make sure safety continues to be delivered. And so I'm going to finish with just the last couple things. There are a lot of people that say, okay, well, if 42,915 is too many, how many lives should we actually be losing on our roadways? I'm one of those folks who says, you know, 0 is the only acceptable goal. The key, of course, is what's on the slide. So when are we going to get there? How are we going to get there? Those are the big questions. Before I left NHTSA, we started actually a Road to Zero coalition. There are now almost 2,000 groups that are part of it. I handed that to Jeff Michael, who was an associate administrator at NHTSA, Debbie Hirschman, a colleague who had been the chairman of the NTSB when I was there. Those two co-chaired to create this Road to Zero organization, 2,000 different members now. They did a report with RAND. How could we get to 0 deaths on our roadways in 30 years? Here it is. Enhance what already works, prioritize safe systems, and you see the last one there? Accelerate advanced technology. And again, having worked, you know, at an autonomous mobility company, it's so exciting. I mean, it's just what the future could be is amazing. But let's be clear, ADAS are on the road saving lives today, preventing crashes today. And so let's not lose sight. And I know there are already some questions about this, is how you balance the two, but let's stay in the here and now. There is technology that can make a huge difference today. And we have to make sure we take full advantage of it. And again, we know who the audience is here today. We got to make sure if something happens to that technology in a bump or a crash or whatever, when it's back on the road, it's got to function at the same level as when it came out of the manufacturer, right? From that factory. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk, Glenn. I think we're going to have a chance to chat with some Q&A. And I really appreciate coming to talk with this group because again, I think when we get down to safety and how to save lives, there's stuff on the roads today that you folks are focused on that can make a real difference.
All right. Thank you very much. Really excellent stuff there. And I want to remind the audience, this is someone who is present while the sausage is being made, as it were, at these organizations. I like to joke around about CASE or ACEs, that the only thing that outnumbers the number of autonomous vehicles on the road right now are the number of white papers about autonomous vehicles. You know, it's sort of the Full Employment Act for academics and pundits. But Dr. Rosekind has actually been involved in the policy making, and so very important to listen to in this regard.
In the arena.
In the arena.
One of my favorite,
yes.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes. Yep.
Yes, Gladiator. Yes. Hopefully you didn't meet the same end. Anyway, I'm going to work my way through some questions. And first, everybody who's on this call, this video conference, questions, please submit them via the chat, and they'll be fed to myself and Mark, and we can address those questions. I'm going to kick off with a few, though. I'm going to start really galactic and then narrow it down to things that might directly affect auctions, repairers, installers, aftermarket dealers in a day-to-day basis in the short term. But to start out with a galactic question, and I'm kind of glad this is actually a virtual conference, because I think if I was in person, someone would punch me out for bringing this question up. So you've been warned, people. But when we look at the road deaths and we see, 5,000 drunk driving, 5,000 seatbelts, are seatbelt interlocks or alcohol breathalyzers built into the car ever going to be? I know what happened last time we tried little mouse seatbelt automatic latches and even buzzers that would remind you your seatbelt wasn't belted. One of your last slides says, do what works. well, we know if you put your seatbelt on, we know if you don't drink, then you won't die as frequently. That's the wrong way to phrase that, I guess. There won't be as many deaths. But those are pretty simple things to do. Is there just no political appetite for this? Again, it's a very politically charged question, but where do those two things stand, do you think?
So Glenn, thank you, because if we don't actually deal with questions that matter, then, we're just kind of shooting the breeze. You should have brought some beers or a good bottle of wine, right? So, I mean, let's go for the good stuff here.
I was trying to not do the drink and driving part, but anyway, go ahead.
Actually, as administrator, I think, feel free to drink, just don't get behind the wheel, right? I mean, nowadays, between rideshare and public transit and everything else, like no reason to do that. Okay. So your question's really interesting. In the Biden-Harris infrastructure law that is in place now, there is, in fact, Congress telling NHTSA to make the drunk driving technology now required in vehicles. So there's something called DADS, and I don't ever remember anymore what the actual stands for, but it's a technology that can analyze breath and touch in a vehicle. It's been 10 years in the making. It's just one example, so it's not the only one, but it's one. And to your point, it took the political will of 10, 15 years, and let's give Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, huge credit because they've been on this for 40 years, right? And over 15 years, got probably 250 laws changed, et cetera. Now we looked at the technology. There's one that exists. And in the new law, there is, in fact, a requirement that NHTSA is supposed to write a regulation to require some technology that will make you will not be able to start your car if a certain level of alcohol is detected in the vehicle. Okay. And so your question was so critical because, so what's it going to take for us to get to seatbelts, right? And how far do we go? Kids in hot cars and car seats in the back. Why should we lose any young child that way anymore? Okay. And again, I like to bring up two things. If the industry thinks this is so important, then you know what? Put those creative juices, get those creative, those hats on that make you brilliant, come up with a solution. You don't need the government to tell you to do that. If you want to save those lives. And some companies like GM and others have actually come up with sensors and things that they put in the back of certain vehicles so you can't leave a kid back there. Okay. And so again, it's like I always say, if there's certain things that are really important, let's get those done. Let's not wait for the government. And to your question, it does take a tremendous amount of political will sometimes to get it across the regulatory finish line. Because that's just a good 10 years for that technology before we saw it come into a requirement that NHTSA, which by the way, is still going to take some years for them to make it a requirement.
Yeah, just as a footnote to that, I use the two most politically challenged ones. You're going to tell me I can't drink, and you're going to tell me I got to wear a seatbelt. But in your field in particular, drowsiness monitors. Those seem like things that most customers would welcome, being sort of, told you just fell asleep for the last 400 yards, kind of thing. I don't know why that hasn't entered cars faster than it has.
Yeah, that's a whole nother slide deck. But just so you know, well, when I was at NASA, we used to get every month somebody saying we have the new fatigue-alizer. So your pilot won't fall asleep. Your fighter pilot, your single seat U2 operator, right? It's like you need a way to keep them awake. Air traffic control. And what's interesting is much harder because you literally can have your eyes open, looking straight ahead, but your brain is asleep.
My college career then, yeah, right.
For most of us, eyes open, nobody's home. And so that's a little bit harder. And so there are other kind of behavioral things you have to look at. I think we're getting closer, especially with AI and machine learning. And there's some great companies kind of taking that on. But to your point, you got a BAC level. Breathalyzer helps you a lot with that. You're looking at drowsy driving. We don't have a fatigue-alizer, makes it much harder.
Moving down from the sort of more galactic to maybe just the solar system level, when we talk about consumer acceptance, the alphabet soup thing I mentioned in my first remarks is just horrible. I mean, we weren't even able to agree on SRS, right? supplemental restraint systems, which is the official term for airbags. Everybody knows it as airbags. And when I look at the different OEMs labeling lane alert, lane centering, et cetera, even if the government, and Hugo mentioned this, doesn't want to regulate the technology, does it make sense to try again? I know this has been tried already, but try again to standardize the alphabet soup. So a customer can say, hey, I've heard about LDW. Does my car have it or not? Is my next car going to have it or not? When I take my car to the repair facility, do I ask them, did you fix my LDW, et cetera? As opposed to, there's just a whole bunch of stuff on my car and I'm really not sure what it does. So is there we're going to try again to kind of stabilize the terminology?
I think that is like the easiest, lowest hanging fruit for an industry group to come together and address. And it's a perfect example. You don't need NHTSA or DOT to say, yes, this is it. If the industry says, here's our standard, here's the best practice, it gets to be pretty hard for people to actually work outside that, okay? And Glenn, I think to your point, you just need that first list of what all those 3-letter acronyms mean. Check, 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 we've got them. According to the criteria, this is what they actually address. And then companies are still fine to do the second half of the sentence, which is, well, XYZ, when you're buying this manufacturer, we call that ABC. That's okay. But as long as you start with, no, we've got check, 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 and those things all lined up across the industry, that would be a huge contribution to both education and safety. And frankly, if you did the work, this is what I was saying, that could be that data-driven best practice that literally is picked up by NHTSA. And I like to point out, you don't need a regulation for that stuff, right?
But I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish about this, in that even if we did have that standardized terminology, I know the challenge of customers getting engaged with it is still very, very high. I mean, when I asked an engineer from SAE a few years ago, what was the greatest safety innovation he could think of, and he said windshield wipers. And you go, well, wait, and anybody who wants to demonstrate how important that is the next time you're on a dark country road at night, make sure there's no one around, and it's pouring rain, turn them off, and you'll turn them back on within seconds. Headlights, etc. The reason I bring these ancient things up is they're very easy to see, and for the consumer to say, I need windshield wipers. Whereas with all these ADAS technologies, it's so much harder for the consumer to get engaged because, well, what does it actually do and why would I like to know? And I find customers that I talk to say, I know my rear view mirror lights up when there's somebody in my blind spot. That's tactile. I don't know what it's called, but I like that. The other things are just so much harder to track down. But one of the questions from the people, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Well, you just brought up a great point, which is the ADAS elements that people love are the ones they can see. So adaptive cruise control. Oh, I'm slowing down. I'm not as close to the blind spot monitoring that you're talking about, right? They love that. If you were to get them to even define what some of those other letters stand for, they would have no clue. And again, I think what you've just identified is you've taken us from the terminology and making it consistent to the education part that is critical, which again could be industry led. Now that we've got this consistent terminology, how do we make sure that people that are buying these cars appreciate when they're repaired, that they're actually asking to make sure that it's repaired back to the level of when I bought it, right? That benefits everybody. But now you've shifted to the education part. Again, I think the whole industry could lead that if it chooses to.
Yeah, and even there, I'm going to be a relentless wet blanket. I apologize here. I'm not recommending we go back to the era of no headlights and seatbelts are for wimps. But, when we talk to consumers about when they're buying a new car, we say, what is the thing you're most dissatisfied with in buying a new car? And they say, how much time it takes. And even when I talk to very progressive dealers who say, now that you've bought this Mercedes, let me walk you through these 15 safety features, they say, give me the keys or give me the app. I'm out of here. I don't want you. The main thing I want you to fix on my car and tell me about before I leave the dealership is, can you pair my cell phone to the Bluetooth?
Yes.
And everything else is just so hard to get their attention. But
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I keep interrupting because you keep bringing up great points. So what's really interesting about that is let's take what I've just been talking about, safety innovation, and apply it to that education, right? So, let's think about virtual reality or augmented reality. Let's think about an app. Let's think about other kinds of simulators that you could have, right? That would actually do that in 3 to 5 minutes. Oh, we got this really cool simulator. You get to sit in your vehicle, not the real one, and do these other things with, again, a headset or whatever it is. And in 5 minutes, I'm going to teach you all those things. So even on your drive home, you're going to get the advantage of all those things. And by the way, again, what are the other safety innovations that the industry could come up with and support so that people could actually learn these things different from what you're saying? Because part of it's like, wait, how long is it going to take? And I'm going to sit here and have to listen to, a salesperson describe, It's like, come on, it's all cool technology. Let's use cool technology then to get people excited about these new advances that they just paid for.
Moving on to a question from the audience about sort of the vehicle that's on the road with ADS on it, as you mentioned many times, as opposed to some of the more pie in the sky robo-taxis of the future. These are on the road now and doing real work now to reduce both collisions and fatalities. But what's the role of the aftermarket beyond the new car has been sold? And let's face it, our industry is fixated on that. Sell the new car, everything else we'll take care of later. But do you see maybe at some point, maybe regulation again, a state inspection regime or something where it says, no, I understand you've got your old Chevrolet fixed, the air conditioning was shot, you told the tech, don't fix the AC, I'll just roll the windows down, I don't need it. But do we need to put in place regulations saying, I'm sorry, I can't let you take this car out until we replace your LiDAR unit? And give the aftermarket some of the enforcement role here in terms of whether it's an auction, getting cars ready for resale, or it's used car dealers buying cars from auctions saying, or new car dealers, installers of any kind, saying, I have a responsibility or a requirement to fix this stuff.
So what you just highlighted is, I think the context, the industry, the whole reason this talk was on the safety imperative is what the industry needs to emphasize is, as opposed to rolling the window down in air conditioning, this is a safety feature that has certain standards that have to be met before it can be on the road. And I think that's step one. And to your question, the other steps are, if there could be industry standards to those and best practices that, again, will help people come into the fold to do that. I don't think at some point, again, remember that innovation, data-driven best practices, regulation, we could end up at regulation, but that's probably not going to happen first. We're going to need the industry to come around what those standards should look like, again, collect the data and set the foundation for, again, this like a no-brainer. It leaves the manufacturer hitting a certain safety standard. If it needs repair, it's got to only go back on the road when it again meets that safety standard. And so I would be cautious to put folks into an enforcement role, right? To be the enforcer, so much as there's a standard, we can't get it on the road until it's actually repaired back to that standard. Again, regulation makes that enforceable by law, but I think if there's an industry best practices sort of standard, that's also a way to go, which again gets back to the industry basically having control over its destiny rather than waiting the time and form for whatever the government might end up doing.
Yeah, and this may roll out at the state level, just like some states do have emissions tests before you can, renew your registration and things like that. So maybe that's how it works its way in, into this. But one of getting a little galactic again. And then we'll get back more specific. What about the fancy word hysteresis, which is you tell the customer they've got all these fancy safety features, and so now they drive more riskily than they otherwise would have. I think you probably can't, being employed by a California entity, you probably can't say the T word here, but there's a lot of noise about, with say, Tesla, for example, of through their marketing or what, so you don't have to address Tesla specifically, but through their marketing sort of encourages people to pay less attention while they're driving. Do we see at some point these features raising the safety level this much, and then drivers see that and they're happy with a higher level of risk, and so they drive more aggressively and take it back down again.
So I think what you're getting to, which again is where you started, let's go to some politically touchy things here. There are always going to be those folks who will push the envelope. And what you're talking about is, people who are going to use the technology to allow them to push the envelope further. I think those people are going to always exist. I think that's what law enforcement's all about, and why regulation is actually pretty critical in some of these areas. And so some of the videos that we've all seen with people being in back seats, it's like, this is not okay. All right. And so I think we just need to, and I was talking to somebody recently, but, laws help society sort of draw the lines. It's like, be independent, go do what you want to do, but don't cross this one, because that's where it's either a ticket or jail, right? I mean, there's a line there. It's not acceptable in our society to do this, okay? So I think what we're going to find is those lines to what you're describing are going to change a little bit, because technology is going to let you do some things maybe you couldn't do before. So we're going to have to readjust those lines occasionally about where you are. What I think is actually a bigger issue that you alluded to is that people start trusting the systems and basically get out of the good habits they developed over a long time. So I've seen, even in the circle of drivers I'm in vehicles with, is blind spot monitoring is remarkable, but the number of people that don't look over their shoulder when they're making a lane change anymore is just amazing, okay? People who I like just a little while ago, I remember watching them do that thinking, wow, that's old school and well done. And all of a sudden now it's like, nope, they don't see a light in the mirror or wherever it is, et cetera. So they're just pulling over, right? And I was literally in a car the other day where somebody kind of cut somebody off making a lane change because they didn't look, and for whatever technological reasons, it hadn't been picked up, no horns were honked, it's like, uh-oh, there's a good example, which I think is the bigger risk, is some of the good driving skills. Humans are pretty good when they're paying attention and following the rules and using good skills. If we start seeing those erode, I think that's going to be a bigger concern potentially than those more outliers that are trying to push the technology.
A last question sort of from the audience here. I hope I don't garble it too much, and this may be something that's outside of your wheelhouse, as it were, but I kind of get the sense that with the multiplying ADAS is going to have an impact on the existing fleet and the vendors of maintenance and repair services, collision repair as well as mechanical, to those vehicles, is going to have an impact on their industry, in that it probably is going to accelerate the exit of the shade tree mechanic. I don't even know if we have any shade tree mechanics left, but certainly DIY, you cannot DIY your lane departure warning system. And as we saw from Dave DeBoer's presentation, this calibration equipment is expensive. And so again, this may not be something you can comment on, but is this something where we go from X thousand, if we have 10,000 body shops now, in 8 years we have 2,000, because only large, well-capitalized ones can really pull off the task of aligning the physical vehicle, but then the censored vehicle, and then debugging all the software as well, and attracting new technicians with radically different skills to get this done. I don't know if you have any comment on that, but it seems to me it would be driving the industry in that direction.
And I agree. I think if we talk about creating standards that have to be met, that require training and certain equipment, that seems like an obvious direction that has to go. I will just say that I think fascinating concept, again, trying to think innovatively, is like your DIY, why couldn't there be training so that you literally could do that on your own vehicle? And so there's there's one bay that's available for the DIYers that have their certification, which they picked up at wherever they were able to do that, and they get to still maintain their vehicle or still do whatever, or have maybe a little side gig that they're doing, etc. And so I agree, and I think for a lot of good reasons, you may want that transition to making sure the right, the correctly trained equipped people are doing the right kind of job to make sure it meets that safety criteria. But could you come up with some way of making sure you could still get hands-on to continue, however you want to work on your vehicle? That could be a possibility in the future. Again, take some creativity to figure that out.
Another one that might be outside your wheelhouse, but I just think I'd float out there. Where do you think liability flows here? So, to the extent that the installer or repairer says, you need a new LiDAR unit. It's $1,100, and the customer says, forget it, don't do it. Again, this is maybe an abstract question, but does the technician or the dealer say, okay, or do they flag it in the vehicle's record that the safety system was disabled at the request of the customer, and it's not my fault? I don't want to get morbid, but deaths are involved here. Any sense of how the liability might flow across the installed fleet? We know how the liability flows for the new vehicle. The OEM is on the hook for making sure the vehicle is built to meet the specifications, but what about when they're all out there, especially with over-the-air software updates, where you can argue the car that was sold 2 years ago is now a new vehicle again in a way, and that its software is just updated. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting very convoluted here.
Yeah, no, see, these are in the details of how we advance all this technology, like to maximum benefit. So it's not outside the wheelhouse, because we used to get this asked in NHTSA all the time. With a fully self-driving vehicle, who's responsible? So I've often felt it's actually pretty straightforward. At level 4 and 5, the manufacturer is responsible, just like it is in that, right? At levels 1 and 2, also pretty straightforward, because you're still responsible. Level 3 is the one I think that's going to be challenging. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, the courts may be the one to figure that out, right? I gave you a warning, but you didn't take over fast enough. You gave me a warning milliseconds before, couldn't do it. So to your point, though, for this audience, I think that's what will happen probably at some point, which is the manufacturer is required to, provide that safety equipment. If you repaired it, you want to repair it to a certain criteria, so you and everyone else is covered to say it meets the criteria. If someone says, I don't want it, they basically are then taking the responsibility for, I've now changed the safety capability of my vehicle. And if something happens, they've taken on that responsibility. And again, I think these are a lot of future discussions to figure it out.
Yeah, and maybe this is something that goes into the vehicle's permanent record, like a Carfax or something, about what's been taken off. To your point about the turning off the system, probably the last thing any driver in America ever wants to hear is your car's computer saying, Mark, there's a situation up ahead I can't figure out, so I'm turning control back to you. Yeah, right. Very good. Okay, let's wrap up now with closing remarks. Let's see, what's the order here? I guess, should I forget which one, who goes first? I think, Tricia, you go last, right? Yeah.
Yes, that's
okay.
correct.
So just 90 seconds or whatever or 2 minutes on what major takeaways you'd like the audience to leave the session with. Can I put you on the spot, Mark, for that?
And I think it's actually pretty brief. One is take control of your destiny. Don't wait for the federal government or others. I think there's a chance for this industry to come together and work on terminology and safety criteria, et cetera, education right now. And that's kind of my final comment is, I really think this industry needs to grab onto and hold on to the fact safety is being delivered today by ADAS that's already on our vehicles on the road now. Huge advantage. We're talking about all these road deaths, et cetera. Things are being done now on your vehicle to help you. Let's take full advantage of them and figure out how to make them even better. And by the way, that should be over the life of the use of that vehicle.
Yeah, and that is so hard to do when everybody says, well, I'm waiting for my robo-car to come and take care of it for me, as opposed to pointing out to them, cross-traffic backup cameras, which are sort of miraculous for saving against collisions. My wrap-up, I guess, would not be so, it would be a little more, have several parts. A, this stuff not only is coming, it's already there. It's been there for years. It's at 100% penetration at one level or another for all cars being sold in the United States. It's just a matter of what level of gizmo is on there. B, I think as someone involved in the industry in your business, I think maybe it's as brutal a decision as, do I jump in and reinvest in the business in order to be able to manage, repair, and address these systems, or maybe that's $2 million in capital for my shop. I don't know if I can afford that, and maybe I'm going to have to pass on this one. Maybe I'll sell my collision repair shop to somebody else who can, with greater volume, can get into it. But I think that's something to think about is, in our industry, we're always talking about changes coming. This is already there. It's more electronic and it's more software driven and it's more capital intensive to fix. And so that probably means your shop 10 years from now will look different from the shop of today. And I think you got to make a decision. Do I want to go that way or not? I don't think either one's the right decision. They both are in the context of your situation. But it's time to really think hard about this. This will not just be, doing a few things differently. This could be a major transformation of the economics of your shop. That's where I'd end.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, today was the beginning of a very important conversation. The automotive industry needs to work together as we enhance safety. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Dave, and the Burke Porter Group. Really fascinating conversation all the way around. And lastly, I'd like to thank the Cox Mobility team for assisting in putting this event together. The recording of today's summit will be on NAAA's website. As Mark mentioned, and I firmly agree, this industry has an opportunity to come together and control our destiny. NAAA is well positioned to continue this conversation. So as NAAA members or anyone in this industry, please reach out to the NAAA Auction Standards co-chairs. This is certainly a topic that is top of mind now and will continue to be so. Attend our upcoming events. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending and have an enjoyable afternoon.